It's a very confusing series for me, the book of James, because every time we talk about it in meetings or whatever, I think people are talking to me or about me. But no, it's the book of James. We're doing a series on the book of James. And the idea that, as Jane mentioned, the focus we're wanting to look at is, what does mature faith look like? James in his book is presenting an idea of this is what mature faith looks like. This is how someone with mature faith lives, which is quite helpful because James says a lot. He goes through a lot of different things. And that's kind of what I want us to focus on this morning. There's a lot in this passage, things I won't mention, won't talk about, because I'm thinking about this idea of it being James presenting to us. This is what it looks like to have mature faith. If you remember, Oz opened the series talking about what it meant to have mature faith going through trials. Ollie spoke last week about mature faith being about living out the word, not just hearing it. And James is writing, he says at the beginning of the book, he's writing to the scattered 12 tribes. So it's a book to Jewish believers. And sometimes I think the difficulty we can have with the Bible is that it's an old book, and when you read a letter like this, which is written to scattered Jewish believers across the Middle East, you kind of feel, well, what does it mean to us? What does it say to us in an age of AI and genetic engineering? What does the Bible have to say in our situation? If James were teleported from his time and place to our world, what would he make of it? It's easy to think, obviously he wouldn't recognize the world because of computers and television and all those kind of things. Bear in mind that James would probably have his mind blown by a roll of sellotape. He would not recognize this world, but in other ways, he would recognize the world we live in. It would be very similar to his world because there are some things that have not changed. And a lot of the things the Bible speaks about and speaks to are human nature, which is the same now as it was 2,000 years ago. To us living in Canterbury and Kent in 2025, to Jewish believers scattered across the ancient Near East, sort of 2,000 years ago. Because James says to them, he says, look, don't show favoritism. This is what he says to the believers here. Don't show favoritism. Of course, favoritism is not a problem that is constrained to a particular people group or a particular time and place. I read about an administrator in a large American mental health clinic where people would walk in, they would make appointments with counsellors and so on. And this administrator noticed that his clinic suffered from what he called the BYMF factor, which stood for the beautiful young male or beautiful young female factor, because he noticed that when young, attractive people came into the clinic, the receptionist treated them differently to other people. They gave them more information about the clinic. They took more time with them, making sure they knew where they were going. He noticed that if you were a BYMF, then someone who was assigned to you to help you find a counsellor, they would see you more promptly. And they would spend more time with you trying to get an appropriate sort of match-up. If you were elderly, not classically good looking, if you were obviously poor, if you were a minority, he noticed you had to wait longer in reception, you had a shortened intake interview, and you often had to wait longer for your counsellor's appointment. And all of this happened in a place that had policies about equality and was committed to treating everyone the same. And if you spoke to the employees, they would sort of swear blind that that's what they did. They treated everyone the same, regardless of who they were. But if we're honest with ourselves, this is what happens. We prefer other people to others. We prefer certain people to others. That's what happens regardless of our convictions and honestly held beliefs. It is just human nature. to prefer some people to others. We don't even know we're doing it a lot of the time. And in this case, James says, this is what you are doing. He challenges believers for showing favoritism to the rich. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with being a welcoming church. Of course, there is nothing wrong with welcoming rich people and making them feel very comfortable in church. The elders said, I had to say that, by the way. But James says, you are welcoming the rich and neglecting the poor. That it's not just a case of you're being a welcoming church, you are being selectively welcoming. You are showing preferential treatment to people based on whether or not they have money. You are spending more time, paying more attention to someone. You are looking down, he says, you are neglecting, you are dishonoring the poor because they're not rich. Simply because of that. Now, maybe at Barton or churches you've been to, you may think we are pretty good at not showing favoritism. But as I've said, it's human nature. There will be people we get on with, people we like to see come through the doors of the church, and people we may be a bit apprehensive about seeing come in. There'll be people we don't mind sitting next to on a Sunday morning, and people who we hope will sit on the other side of the church. And it probably doesn't have anything to do with whether they look poor or rich. That's probably not the thing we struggle with. When I was a young assistant minister at a church in Holland-on-Sea, which is in Essex, I was training to be a Baptist minister at the time. I used to get every week, I think it was weekly, I used to get the Baptist Times, which was a newspaper from the Baptist Union of Great Britain. And I would get one and I'd read it cover to cover like a good little Baptist. And I remember reading one thing, it was about Easter, and the Baptist Union was saying, we're bringing out a Lent study book. We've got a study book for Lent, a Bible study book, so you can have it, and every day through Lent you can read a passage and do a little study by someone. And they were saying, look at some of the people we've got to contribute to our Lent study book. And they listed people who they'd got to write for this study book. And one of the people they got was Anne Widdecombe, who used to be a Conservative MP. I think she's reformed now, actually. And I remember, and the reason that stood out is because they'd sort of put a little extract from her, what she'd written for the Lent study guide, and I read it, and it wasn't that great. I was not impressed. And I was thinking, is this what we're doing now? We're getting, Lent study guides written by politicians. Is the Baptist Union so starved of spiritual input that we have to outsource our theological education? And I did what all, young, radical, passionate, firebrand preachers did. I wrote a letter to the Baptist Times. It was an email, actually. This wasn't, it wasn't in the ancient past. And saying this, well, she said this. I'm not sure, this is a particularly accurate theological point she's made, but really, and they printed my letter. If you go back and you can find an ancient Baptist Times with a letter from Outraged of Holland-on-Sea complaining about the Lent study guide the Baptist Union was producing. But the thing that I suppose I was really annoyed about was that they hadn't chosen Anne Widdecombe. Sorry for picking on her. There were other people involved. But they hadn't chosen these people because they thought these are people with some profound theological insight. We all know why they've chosen people like this. It's the same reason we do things like this. It's because it's easier to sell a Lent Bible study with contributions by Anne Widdecombe than it is to sell one with contributions by Oz Power or me or someone like that. That's just the cold, hard reality of it. If you want people to take notice, put a name on your Lent Bible study. And that was, I suppose, what really bothered me about the whole thing. Not just the sort of I took umbrage at the point she was making, but I was kind of annoyed, I suppose I still am, that we are more interested in what people have to say if they're famous. We're more interested in what people have to say if we already know who they are. We live now in an age of influencers, and that whole term says it all, doesn't it? What is this person? They're an influencer. What's their job? To influence. Why are they famous? They just are. They're famous for being famous, and they sort of have an influence over people. You don't even need to be good at anything these days. And we in the church have to wrestle with the same problem. Who do we allow to be our influencers, and why? What is it that we are looking for? What impresses us? Why do we think this particular person is worth paying attention to? What values do we look for in the women and men that are on the front pages of our publications or our websites, speaking at our events, writing our books? Do we value people who have something worth listening to, or people who we think, well, they'll sell tickets if their name's on the poster? People will notice what we're doing if they're involved. Sometimes I worry that we as the people of God just end up playing the same games that the world plays. We show favoritism. And we value the experiences, the story, the insights of an individual because they are successful at something that is completely unrelated to living a life of obedience to Christ. You see, I think this is perhaps the root of the issue, what James is writing about here. There's a sense in which when we say don't show favoritism, we think the answer is to have no favorites, to treat everyone the same, to close our eyes to all the differences, to not make judgments. But I'm not sure that's what James is getting at, because he says in black and white in this chapter, he says earlier in chapter 1, all through the book, he says essentially that God is making judgments. God, he says, has already chosen the poor to be blessed. He says in chapter 1, the passage that Oz looked at, he talked already about how the poor should take pride in their value in God's eyes, whereas the wealthy should take pride in their low state. All through James, he brings up this theme of the poor versus the rich, and it's the same thing every time. God has chosen the poor to be blessed. God has valued the poor. God makes a judgment on the rich already. He has made a judgment for the poor against the rich. He has chosen the poor to be valued and blessed in his sight, while the wealthy have already received their blessing by being valued in the sight of the world. So when believers that James writes to are showing favour to the rich and neglecting the poor, they are siding against God. And this, I think, is the issue. When James says, look, don't show discrimination, don't become judges with evil thoughts. The problem here is the fact, not that they are judging, but they are judges with evil thoughts. They are showing a lack of discernment. They are thinking the opposite way to how God thinks. And James criticizes them for this lack of wisdom. The rich are the ones exploiting you, he says. This is a persecuted church. We read about this in chapter 1. This is a persecuted church. And James says, these are the people who are persecuting you. And yet you treat them as though they are the most special people you can have in the church. Why do they do it? It's probably for the same reasons we do it. We get impressed by the wrong things. We value the things that the world values rather than the things that God values. Maybe we think, as the church in this time may have thought, that if we cozy up to the ones in power, if we look for approval from the ones with influence, it will make our lives easier. Maybe the persecution will stop. Maybe it makes us feel better about our faith. Maybe there's a part of us that's really a bit insecure about our faith. And it makes us feel a little bit better when someone the world respects says something or has a faith or something like that. It's like we get a bit of reflected glory. We can say, look, I can't be weird because they believe it too. Whatever is going on in the church in James's time and whatever is going on in our own hearts and minds, James says, don't show favoritism, and especially you're showing it to the wrong people anyway. You are valuing the wrong qualities. God looks favorably on the poor, and you push them to one side to look favorably on the ones who are oppressing you and those whom God looks favorably on. And here I think we find James highlighting the difference between mature faith and immature faith. Immature faith judges based on qualities that it personally values. Immature faith says, well, to me, being rich is important, being popular is important, being intelligent is important, being good looking is important. That's what immature faith. Mature faith makes judgments based on what God values, on what is important to God. And immature faith, having decided what it values, says, having decided this, I will now show more love, make more effort with the people who demonstrate these values, who embody these values. Whereas mature faith says, I will love my neighbour as myself, regardless of personal preference, regardless of whether I like my neighbour, regardless of whether I wish your neighbour was my neighbour, and you had to deal with my neighbour. I will love them regardless. Immature faith has an internal list of rules about who is good and who is bad, what is good and what is bad, and it judges everything and everyone against that internal list. They judge the world, themselves, others against that checklist. Mature faith says, I do not live under an inflexible law. I work to God's values. And I understand ultimately that God is not looking for me to measure anyone or anything against a checklist, but for me to display his qualities, such as mercy, discernment, love, grace, patience. That's the difference between mature faith and immature faith. Immature faith has a list of values that is personal, treats people differently depending on those values, and thinks that those values are God's values. Mature faith says, I will value what matters to God. I will love people regardless of what I think of them. And I will understand that my life is not governed by a checklist, but by a desire to be a living embodiment of the values of my Father. Therefore, immature faith is easy, because immature faith just lets you carry on living your best life, saying nice things to people you like, being mean about the people you don't like, and following your own value system, all the while deceiving yourself into thinking that it's God's value system, when all you've really done is made God in your own image, and it turns out he likes all the same people you like and dislikes all the same people you dislike. Isn't that convenient? Mature faith, it turns out, is hard, because mature faith says, I need to be aware of who I am, my biases, my favoritism, and I need to not let that influence how I treat others. I need to watch out for those ways of thinking in my life where I'm actually out of step with God's values. And I need to do something about it. Work to transform and renew my mind. Mature faith says, I've got to put some work in here. I have to learn what God's values actually are. And that's going to take time and effort. Scientist Paul Feynman says, knowledge is not free, it requires paying attention. And I think it's absolutely true about faith too. Faith, growing in your faith, getting to know God better is not free. It requires paying attention. So where are we this morning? Would we say, yep, immature faith, mature faith, in this area, I feel like I'm heading in one of these two directions. Favoritism, judging with evil thoughts, valuing what we want rather than what God is looking for, which will generally be the same things the world values. Being interested in those people we value. Or mature faith, valuing what God wants, loving others regardless, embodying his qualities. And if we're in the immature faith camp, do we want to change? Because as I said, it's hard work. But James tells us to live as those who will be judged by the law that gives freedom. Because that's ultimately what mature faith gives. It is not a personal law, not a law of the world, which likes the BYFMs, but the law that gives freedom from evil thoughts, freedom from having to play the games of the world, freedom from being the sort of person that the world says, this is who you should be, freedom to be God's men and women, freedom to do what is right rather than what is easy. That's the goal. And how do we get there? Well, I think the solution is the same for many of our problems. We just need to know God better. Spend time with God. Learn who he is. Learn what he values. Ask him to shape us so that we fall in love with the things he already loves. We don't need to learn new rules. We need to walk closer with Jesus. Because you cannot be Christ-like if you don't know what Christ is like. And wouldn't it be nice if James were to be teleported to this world once he got over his shock, microwave popcorn and things like that? Wouldn't it be nice if he was able to look at the church in this day and age and say, you know what? I think they're learning.